I had been a volunteer fire tower steward with the Friends of Kempshall Mountain for 2 seasons when I asked the chapter coordinator why Tower 7's cabs stayed padlocked through July and August, while every other tower in the district opened for hikers on Memorial Day weekend. Her name was Diane Paletti. She had run the volunteer program since 2014, and she was one of those people who remembered every steward's name, every trailhead parking lot that needed gravel, every broken step on every staircase across 4 mountains. If you had a question about any tower in the southern cluster, Diane had the answer before you finished asking. Except for this one. DEC says it's structural, she told me over the phone in late March. Same thing they said last year. I asked if there was an engineer's report. She said she'd requested one twice. The first time, she got a form letter referencing a statewide inspection backlog. The second time, she got nothing. I should explain what I was doing there. I'm a high school physics teacher in Gloversville. I've been hiking the Adirondacks since my 20s, finished the Fire Tower Challenge in 2019, and started volunteering as a steward because I liked the work. You sit in the cab on summer weekends, talk to hikers about the history, point out the landmarks on the horizon, answer questions about the Osborne firefinder if they're curious. It's quiet, satisfying work. You learn the mountain. If you're someone who appreciates that kind of careful observation, the slow accumulation of detail that comes from spending real time in a real place, then this channel might be something you return to. Ashwarden horror documents wilderness investigations like this one. Not the sensational kind, but the kind that start with a simple question and end somewhere you didn't expect. Consider subscribing if that's the kind of story you value. Kempshall Mountain sits in the western Adirondacks, Hamilton County, inside a wild forest tract that stretches between Route 30 and the Cedar River Corridor. The tower is a standard air motor LS-40, 60 feet of galvanized steel with a 7x7 cab at the top. It was erected in 1934, decommissioned in 1988, and restored by volunteers starting in 2016. I did my first steward shift in June of 2023. Tower 7 is different. It's not on Kempshall. It's 3.5 miles northeast on a ridge called Oxbow Knob, at the edge of the same wild forest boundary. The name Tower 7 is informal. It comes from the old district numbering system that the Conservation Department used before DEC reorganized the ranger districts in the 1970s. Most people just call it the Oxbow Tower. It's the same model as Kempshall Air Motor LS-40, built in 1931. But it was never adopted into the Friends Group's restoration program. DEC maintained nominal jurisdiction. The trail up is unmarked, about 1.25 miles from a pull-off on an old logging road. And the tower itself is in decent shape for something that hasn't had organized volunteer attention. The steel is sound. The stairs are original but passable. The cab, though, has been padlocked since at least 2017, the year Diane started keeping records of her requests. I first hiked to it in October 2023, after the leaves had dropped and you could see the structure from the Kempshall summit through binoculars. It looked fine from a distance. Good vertical alignment. No visible lean. The cross bracing was intact. I mentioned this to Diane, and she agreed she'd been up there herself in 2019 and said the same thing. The tower looked structurally sound. The cab windows were intact. The padlock on the cab hatch was a hardened steel master lock, not a DEC-issue brass lock, which he thought was odd but not conclusive of anything. What bothered Diane wasn't that the tower was locked. Towers get locked for legitimate reasons: radio equipment inside, safety liability during restoration, seasonal closures for hunting. What bothered her was that she couldn't get a straight answer about which reason applied, and the lock never came off. I didn't push it that first year. I had my steward shifts on Kempschel, I had school during the week, and I figured the DEC regional office had its own priorities. Budget pressures, staffing shortages, the usual. Not everything that looks like secrecy is secrecy. Sometimes it's just a bureaucracy that doesn't have time to answer your email. But in February 2024, something changed my mind. Diane forwarded me a message from a hiker named Paul Ostrander, who had gone up the Oxbow Trail in late January on snowshoes. Paul was an experienced winter hiker. He'd completed the Winter 46 and was working on a personal fire tower project, trying to photograph every standing tower in the park during all 4 seasons. He had reached the base of Tower 7 on a clear Saturday morning, temperature around 12 degrees, and noticed something he couldn't explain. The cab windows were fogged, all 4 sides, from the inside. Paul had included 3 photographs. They were taken with a phone camera from the base of the tower, zoomed in, so the resolution wasn't perfect, but you could see it clearly enough. The glass on all 4 sides of the cab had a uniform interior condensation layer. In January, at elevation, on a day with 12-degree air and low humidity. He wrote, "I've photographed about 40 fire tower cabs in winter conditions. I've never seen interior condensation like this. It implies a heat source or a significant moisture source inside the cab. I considered the possibility that an animal got in. But the hatch padlock was intact and all 4 windows were unbroken. I have no explanation." Diane had sent this to the DEC Regional Forester's office, with a note asking whether any equipment inside the cab might account for the condensation. She received no reply. I looked at the photos for a long time. Paul was right that it was unusual. Fire tower cabs in winter are essentially outdoor air. The glass is single pane, the seals are old, and the temperature inside the cab equalizes with the outside air within minutes of any residual solar heating. You don't get condensation on the inside of the glass unless there's a moisture differential. Something warmer and wetter than the ambient air had to be present inside that cab. I could think of a few explanations. A raccoon or porcupine that had found a way in through a gap Paul couldn't see from ground level. Residual moisture from a recent thaw cycle trapped by a temporarily better seal than expected. Even a small equipment battery venting gas, though that would be unusual for a cab that supposedly had nothing in it. None of these explanations were very satisfying, but none of them were impossible. I filed it away. Spring came. I did my first Kempschel steward shift of the season on the last Saturday in May. The morning was cold, 38 degrees at the trailhead, probably 32 at the summit, and the cab was rimed with frost on the outside of the glass when I unlocked it at 7:30. Normal. I wiped down the fire finder, set out the laminated history cards, and waited for hikers. The third group that day included a man in his 60s named Gerald Mott. He'd been hiking the Adirondacks for decades, knew the trails better than most rangers, and had a habit of asking stewards questions that were actually tests. He wanted to know if you knew your mountain. I liked him. We talked about the Kempschel Tower's history for a while, the observers who'd staffed it, the 1953 fire season that had been the busiest on record, the phone line that used to run down the South Ridge to the ranger's cabin at the base. Then he asked me, almost as an afterthought, if I'd ever been up to the Oxbow Tower. I told him I had, once, in the fall. "You go up in the summer," he said. "You'll notice something." I asked what he meant. "The cab smells wrong." I waited for him to elaborate. He took a sip from his water bottle, looked out toward the northwest, where Oxbow Knob was hidden behind the intervening ridge, and said, "I was a fire observer. Blue Mountain, 1986 through 88. Last 3 years they staffed it. I've been in a lot of cabs. They all smell the same old wood, metal, whatever sealant they used on the windows. Oxbow smells different, even from below the hatch. He said he'd noticed it in 2021, the first time he'd hiked the Oxbow Trail since its informal re-clearing by a local hiking group. He'd gone back every summer since, and the smell was consistent. He described it as organic. Not decay, not animal waste, not mold. Something biological that he couldn't place. "Did you report it?" I asked. He gave me a look that I recognized from teaching, the look a student gives you when you've asked an obvious question. Who would I report it to? He had a point. The tower wasn't part of any active restoration program. The trail wasn't officially maintained. DEC's position was that the structure was closed for safety reasons. Reporting a strange smell in a locked cab to an agency that wouldn't acknowledge the locked cab was a conversation that went nowhere before it started. Gerald didn't seem worried about it exactly. He seemed like a man who had noticed something precise and was waiting to see if anyone else had noticed it too. After he left, I sat in the Kempshall cab for the rest of the afternoon, watching the clouds build over the western ridges, and thought about what he'd said. 2 data points now: condensation in winter, an unexplained smell in summer, both observed by experienced people, both involving the interior of a locked cab that DEC wouldn't discuss. I decided I would hike to Oxbow on my next day off. That was June 11th, 2024, a Tuesday. I parked at the pull-off on the logging road at 6:45 in the morning. The road itself is gated about a quarter-mile past the pull-off DEC gate, standard steel pipe, padlocked. The trail to the tower branches off the road about 200 yards past the gate, and you can step around the gate easily on foot, which most hikers do. The trail climbs moderately through mixed hardwood for the first half-mile, then steepens through a spruce-fir transition zone before reaching the open summit at around 2,800 feet. The tower is visible from about a quarter-mile out, standing above the stunted conifers on the ridgeline. It looked exactly as it had in October, structurally sound, vertical, no visible deterioration that would justify a permanent closure. I reached the base at 7:50. The morning was mild, maybe 55 degrees, with haze settling into the valleys below. I could smell balsam fir, wet moss, the usual mountain smells. I stood at the base of the tower and looked up. The padlock was there. Same hardened steel master lock. The cab windows, from this angle, looked clear. I climbed the stairs. The staircase on an air motor LS40 is a series of open grate steel flights, switching back at each landing. There are typically 4 or 5 flights depending on total height. The Oxbow Tower has 5. The steel was cold under my hands, the grating solid, the bolts tight. Whatever was wrong with this tower, it wasn't the stairs. I reached the platform just below the cab hatch. This is where you'd stand if you were going to enter the cab. There's a small landing, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, with the hatch directly above you. The hatch itself is a hinged steel door in the floor of the cab. When the tower is open, you push it up and climb through. Gerald Mott was right about the smell. It was faint, but it was there. Not the metal and wood smell of every other fire tower cab I'd stood beneath. Something else underneath it. Organic, as Gerald had said. The closest comparison I could make was the smell of a classroom terrarium, that warm, humid, biological scent of living plants and damp soil in an enclosed space. But attenuated, thin, as though it were being filtered both through the old wood and the window seals of the cab above me. I stood on the landing for several minutes, breathing slowly, trying to isolate it. It wasn't coming from the structure itself. The steel stairs and supports below me smelled exactly like every other tower. It was localized to the cab. I pressed my face close to the seam between the hatch and the cab floor. The smell was stronger there, definitely coming from inside. I tried the padlock. It was locked, obviously. And it was newer than the tower, not rusted, not weathered the way a lock that had been up there since 2017 should have been. Either someone had replaced it recently, or someone was maintaining it, lubricating it, keeping it functional. I looked at the windows from the landing. From this angle, essentially looking up through the glass at an oblique angle, I couldn't see much of the cab interior. The glass was dirty, but intact on all four sides. I could make out the ceiling of the cab, the underside of the roof structure. Nothing that looked like equipment. No radio antenna, no junction box, no battery housing. Whatever DEC was protecting inside this cab, it wasn't communications equipment. I climbed back down. At the base, I walked a slow circuit around the tower, looking at the ground. Fire towers usually have associated infrastructure, a concrete foundation pad, sometimes a buried utility line from the old telephone system, often the remains of a privy or a storage shed. Oxbow had the standard 4 concrete anchor points for the tower legs. About 30 feet to the south, I found the remains of the observer's cabin foundation, flat stones arranged in a rectangle, mostly buried by moss and decades of leaf litter. Nothing unusual. But about 15 feet east of the tower base, I noticed something I'd missed in October. A small area, maybe 3 feet in diameter, where the ground cover was different. The surrounding area was typical summit vegetation moss, low blueberry, stunted spruce. This patch was bare, not dead bare. The soil surface was exposed, dark, slightly moist-looking. It reminded me of a spot where something had been dug up and filled back in, but not recently. The vegetation had had time to fail to regrow, which suggested the disturbance was older than one season. I crouched and looked more closely. The soil was darker than the surrounding ground, not dramatically, but noticeably. I picked up a small amount with my fingers. It felt different, finer texture, almost silty compared to the rocky, organic summit soil around it. It also had a faint smell. The same smell as the cab, but earthier, more concentrated. I didn't dig. I had no authority to dig on state land, and I didn't want to disturb what might be evidence of something I didn't yet understand. I took 3 photographs of the bare patch from different angles, measured its approximate dimensions by pacing, and noted its position relative to the tower base using my phone's compass. Then I hiked back down. That evening, I called Diane and described what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I need to tell you something I probably should have told you when you first asked about that tower." I waited. In 2019, when I went up there myself, I took a soil sample from a spot just like the one you're describing. I sent it to a friend at SUNY-ESF who does soil science. She analyzed it as a favor. And she said it was anomalous. The nutrient profile didn't match the expected summit soil at that elevation. The phosphorus levels were extremely high. The organic carbon content was elevated. And there were trace compounds she couldn't identify without a more detailed analysis, which she didn't have time or funding to do. I asked Diane why she hadn't mentioned this before. Because I didn't know what it meant, and I still don't. High phosphorus in summit soil could mean a lot of things. Old latrine site from the observer's cabin. Decades of accumulated bird droppings concentrated in one spot. Minerals seep from the bedrock. I didn't want to turn a soil chemistry question into a conspiracy theory. This was reasonable. Diane was a careful person. She didn't speculate beyond her evidence. But she had one more detail. My friend at ESF said one thing that stuck with me. She said the phosphorus to nitrogen ratio was unusual for any of those explanations. In a latrine site or a bird colony, you'd expect high nitrogen alongside the phosphorus. In her sample, the nitrogen was normal. Only the phosphorus was elevated, along with those unidentified organics. She said she'd seen similar profiles in soils associated with certain types of fungal activity, but she couldn't be more specific without doing a full microbial analysis. Fungal activity on an exposed summit. In soil that somehow maintained itself as a bare, moist patch in an environment where everything around it was either rock, moss, or stunted conifers. I went back to the photographs Paul Ostrander had taken in January. Interior condensation on all 4 cab windows. A moisture source inside the cab. An organic smell detectable through the sealed hatch. And now, anomalous soil chemistry in a bare patch at the base of the tower, consistent with something biological that shouldn't have been there. I spent the next week thinking about this more carefully than I'd thought about anything since graduate school. I'm a physics teacher, not a biologist, but I understand systems. Something was producing moisture and organic compounds inside that cab. Something had altered the soil chemistry at the base. These could be unrelated phenomena, or they could be aspects of the same process. What I needed was someone who could look at this from a biological perspective, and I needed to see the inside of that cab. The second problem was easier to approach than the first, though it took longer than I expected. On June 18th, I sent a formal email to the DEC Region 5 office in Raybrook, identifying myself as a Friends of Kempshall volunteer and asking for clarification on the Oxbow Tower closure. I cited the 2017 date Diane had given me, noted that no engineer's report appeared to be on file, and asked whether there were plans to either restore the tower for public access or formally decommission it. I received a reply 9 days later from a regional forester named Cliff Sutherland. He thanked me for my interest and said that the Oxbow Tower remains closed to public access due to ongoing assessment of the structure's condition and associated site considerations. He said there was no current timeline for restoration or removal, and recommended that hikers exercise caution around closed structures and respect posted closures. Associated site considerations. That was a phrase I hadn't encountered in any other DEC communication about fire towers. Structural closures cite structural issues. Equipment closures cite equipment. Associated site considerations was something else. It was the kind of language an agency uses when the real reason doesn't fit neatly into the standard categories. I wrote back and asked specifically what associated site considerations meant. Sutherland didn't reply. I also, at Diane's suggestion, submitted a Freedom of Information request through the DEC's FOIL portal, asking for any inspection reports, engineering assessments, internal memoranda, or correspondence related to the Oxbow Knob Fire Tower from 2015 to the present. The response would take weeks, but the clock was now running. In the meantime, I found my biologist. Her name was Sandra Yoon. She was a mycologist, a fungal biologist doing postdoctoral work at Paul Smith's College, about 90 miles north of Kempshall. I found her through a paper she'd published on high-elevation fungal communities in the northeastern United States. The paper specifically discussed unusual fungal colonization patterns on exposed Adirondack summits, which seemed relevant. I emailed her a description of what I'd observed: the bare soil patch, the smell, the condensation, Diane's soil analysis, without speculating about what it might mean. I asked if any of it suggested a fungal explanation. She wrote back the same day. She was interested, More than interested, she was, as she later told me, professionally startled by the phosphorus data. She asked if she could visit the site. We hiked to Oxbow together on July 3rd, a Wednesday. Sandra brought collection equipment, sterile sample bags, a small coring tool, a handheld temperature probe, and a humidity meter. I brought my camera and a notebook. The morning was warm and overcast, temperature around 65 at the summit. We reached the tower at 8:30. Sandra stopped about 20 feet from the base and just looked at it for a full minute without speaking. Then she said, "Where's the bear patch?" I walked her to it. It was unchanged from 3 weeks earlier, same diameter, same dark, moist soil, same absence of surrounding vegetation. Sandra crouched over it and didn't move for a long time. She used the temperature probe first. The soil surface was 58 degrees. She pushed the probe in about 3 inches, 61 degrees. She pulled it out and probed the surrounding moss-covered soil. Surface, 54 degrees. 3 inches, 55 degrees. "The patch is warmer," I said. "Yes." She didn't look up. She opened the humidity meter and held it a few inches above the bare soil, then above the surrounding ground. She read both numbers and wrote them in her notebook without telling me what they were. She took 4 soil cores from the patch, each about 6 inches deep, sealing them in separate bags. She also took 2 control cores from the surrounding soil at measured distances from the patch. While she worked, I climbed the tower. The smell was there again, same as before, that warm, biological terrarium scent. Sandra had given me a small, handheld air quality meter before we started, and I held it near the hatch seam. The readings were unremarkable for standard pollutants, but the humidity reading near the hatch was 11% higher than the ambient air at the same elevation. There was measurably more moisture coming through the cab than the atmosphere contained. I called down to Sandra and told her. She paused her coring, looked up at me, and said something I didn't expect. "I need to get into that cab." "It's locked." "I know, but what you're describing, if the humidity differential is consistent, and if it's connected to what I'm seeing in this soil, this isn't a question I can answer from the ground." I told her I was working on access through DEC. She nodded and went back to her samples. We spent another hour at the site. Sandra photographed the bare patch extensively, took measurements of its perimeter, and examined the tower's 4 concrete footings closely. At the northeast footing, she stopped. "Come look at this." I climbed down and joined her. She was pointing at the junction between the steel tower leg and the concrete anchor. On 3 of the 4 footings, this junction was clean steel meeting concrete with maybe a little rust staining and some lichen. On the northeast footing, there was something else. A thin, dark line running along the seam between the metal and the concrete, extending down into the ground. Sir, it looked almost like a root, but it wasn't woody. It was darker than any root I'd seen, and it had a slightly glossy surface. Sandra didn't touch it. She photographed it from several angles and then used a wooden probe to gently lift a tiny section. It was flexible, slightly moist, and it left a dark smear on the probe. "Is that a fungal structure?" I asked. She sat back on her heels and looked at the tower above us. "It's hyphal," she said. "That's a fungal growth structure. But the morphology is unusual. The diameter is too large for most species I work with. And the pigmentation is wrong for a standard saprotrophic fungus at this elevation." She placed the probe in a sealed bag, labeled it, and stood up. "I need to get into that cab," she said again. The foil response arrived on July 19th, 16 days after Sandra and I hiked to the tower. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table expecting a stack of inspection reports. Instead, I got 11 pages. 3 were cover sheets. 2 were duplicate copies of Cliff Sutherland's email to me, which I already had. 1 was a single-paragraph memo from 2017, unsigned, stating that the Oxbow Knob Fire Tower is to remain secured pending further evaluation, and listing no reason, no requesting authority, and no timeline. The remaining 5 pages were partially redacted correspondence between the Region 5 office and DEC's Division of Lands and Forests in Albany, dated 2018. The redactions were heavy, full sentences blacked out, sometimes full paragraphs. But what remained was readable, and it was strange. One passage from an Albany-based DEC official read, "The site assessment conducted in September 2017 identified conditions within the cab structure that do not correspond to any standard maintenance or wildlife intrusion scenario. Until these conditions are evaluated by appropriate specialists, the structure should remain secured and public access should not be permitted." Another, from what appeared to be a reply from the regional office. "We concur with the recommendation to maintain closure. However, we note that the redacted observed during the September assessment has redacted since the initial documentation. Request guidance on whether a follow-up assessment is warranted given redacted." And a final passage from Albany again. "A follow-up assessment is not authorized at this time. Maintain current closure status. Direct any public inquiries to the standard structural assessment language." Standard structural assessment language. That was the phrase that sat with me. DEC had explicitly instructed its regional staff to use structural safety as a cover explanation. The real reason for the closure was something else, as something observed inside the cab in September 2017. Something that had apparently changed between 2017 and 2018. Something that required appropriate specialists who had never, as far as these documents indicated, actually been sent. I scanned the pages and emailed them to Diane and Sandra separately. Diane called me within an hour. She was angry, which was unusual for her. Not the dramatic kind of anger, the quiet, focused kind that comes from someone who has spent years being polite to an institution that was lying to her. "They told me it was structural," she said. "Every time I asked, every single time. Structural assessment backlog. And now I'm looking at a memo that says they were told to say that." I didn't have a good response. She was right. Sandra called the next morning. She wasn't angry. She was excited, which worried me slightly more. "The soil cores are back from preliminary analysis," she said. "I need to walk you through this in person. Can you come to Paul Smith's?" I drove up on a Saturday, July 27th. Sandra's lab was a small room in the basement of the college's science building. 2 microscopes, a fume hood, a rack of sample jars, and a desk overflowing with papers. She'd pinned a topographic map of the Oxbow Knob area to the wall above her desk, with the tower location circled in red. She started with the soil cores. The 2 control samples taken from the surrounding summit soil showed exactly what you'd expect at 2,800 feet in the central Adirondacks. Thin organic layer over glacial till, low to moderate nutrient levels. Typical fungal community dominated by ectomycorrhizal species associated with spruce and fir roots. Normal. The 4 cores from the bare patch were not normal. "The phosphorus levels confirm what Diane's friend found," Sandra said. "Extremely elevated, well beyond what you'd see from animal waste or decomposition. But that's not the interesting part." She pulled up images on her laptop. "Microscopy. I'm not trained to read fungal microscopy, But even I could see the difference between the control samples and the patch samples. The control slides showed scattered, thin filaments, standard mycelial networks, the underground architecture of common forest fungi. The patch slides showed something denser, much denser. Thick, dark hyphae arranged in organized structures that Sandra said were unlike anything in her reference library for northeastern high-elevation fungi. These are forming something called a mycelial cord, she explained. It's a structure some fungi use for long-distance nutrient transport. Think of it as a pipeline, but the ones I study are usually a millimeter or two in diameter at most, and they're associated with specific wood decay species. These are larger. Some of them are approaching 4 millimeters, and the cellular structure doesn't match any wood decay species I know. She showed me a cross-section image. The cord structure had a distinct outer sheath of tightly packed cells surrounding a looser interior matrix. She said this was consistent with what mycologists called a rhizomorph, a root-like fungal structure capable of growing through soil and even into non-biological substrates. Like concrete, I asked. She looked at me. Like concrete, or like the seam between a steel structure and a concrete footing. The dark line we'd seen at the northeast footing. It was part of this same organism, or at least the same type of organism. A fungal structure growing from the soil up into the tower's foundation, following the path of least resistance along the metal-concrete junction. "Where's it going?" I asked. "Up," Sandra said. "That's my hypothesis based on what we're seeing. The rhizomorph is using the tower structure as a scaffold. It's climbing." She pulled up another image, the probe sample from the northeast footing, magnified. The dark, glossy material I'd seen was indeed a rhizomorphic structure, and within it, Sandra had identified active hyphal growth tips. The organism was alive and extending. "How fast?" I asked. "I can't determine that from a single sample point. I'd need to mark the growth front and return to measure advancement over time. But based on the diameter and the density of the growth tips, this is not a slow organism. Most rhizomorphs I've studied grow a few centimeters per year. The growth tip density in this sample suggests something considerably faster." I sat with that for a moment. A fungal organism of unknown species, producing rhizomorphs of unusual size, growing from anomalous soil at the base of a fire tower, apparently climbing the structure toward a locked cab that smelled like a terrarium and generated its own humidity. "Sandra," I said, "what is it?" She leaned back in her chair. "I don't know. I've sent tissue samples to 2 colleagues for DNA sequencing, one at SUNY-ESF, one at the University of Michigan. The morphology doesn't match anything in my working knowledge. That doesn't mean it's a new species. There are tens of thousands of undescribed fungal species in North America. It might be something perfectly well known to someone who works on a different group than I do. But the behavior is unusual. The growth toward an elevated structure, the apparent moisture generation, the soil chemistry modification. Those aren't random. That's a pattern." She paused. "And someone at DEC saw it in 2017, inside the cab, and they locked the door." That sentence changed the shape of the investigation for me. Up until that point, I had been treating this as 2 parallel questions. Why is the tower locked? And what is this biological anomaly at its base? Sandra was telling me they were the same question. Whatever was growing in the soil had already reached the cab 8 years ago. That was what the 2017 assessment team had seen. That was the condition within the cab structure that does not correspond to any standard maintenance or wildlife intrusion scenario. Not an animal, not equipment, a fungal colonization of the cab itself. And according to the 2018 correspondence, it had changed, grown, expanded. And DEC's response had been to lock the door and stop looking. I went back to the FOIL documents that evening and read them again with this framework. The redactions made more sense now. The phrases they'd left visible were the ones that were vague enough to be meaningless out of context. The phrases they'd removed were presumably the ones that described, in specific terms, what was inside the cab. Appropriate specialists likely meant mycologists or biologists of some kind. Specialists who were never sent. Diane had been CC'd on my email to Sandra. And the three of us began coordinating. We needed to get inside that cab. And we needed to do it through channels that DEC would have difficulty refusing. Sandra drafted a formal request to DEC on Paul Smith's college letterhead, identifying herself as a research mycologist, describing the soil findings in technical terms, and requesting supervised access to the Oxbow Tower cab for purposes of a preliminary biological assessment. She framed it carefully, not as a challenge to DEC's closure decision, but as an offer of the specialist evaluation that DEC's own correspondence acknowledged was needed but had never arranged. She sent it to Cliff Sutherland at Region 5, with copies to the Division of Lands and Forests in Albany and to the DEC Commissioner's office. The reply came in 4 days, which was faster than anything Diane had ever gotten. It came not from Sutherland, but from an assistant director in Albany. The answer was no. The tower remains under active assessment by the department, and external access is not authorized at this time. The assistant director thanked Sandra for her interest and suggested she contact the DEC's Bureau of Wildlife if she wished to pursue research on state lands. Sandra was professionally insulted by the redirect to wildlife. "Fungi are not wildlife," she said on the phone. "That's like telling a cardiologist to call the podiatry department." But the speed of the refusal told us something. 4 days from an assistant director when a volunteer coordinator couldn't get a form letter in 6 months. Sandra's request had been flagged, escalated, and denied at a level well above the regional office. Someone in Albany knew what was in that cab and had decided or had been told that nobody outside the department was going to see it. We debated what to do. Sandra wanted to go to the press. Diane counseled patience. I was somewhere in the middle, leaning toward a second FOIL request specifically targeting the September 2017 site assessment, which had to exist as a document somewhere, even if the first FOIL response hadn't included it. While we discussed strategy, I did something I probably should have done earlier. I went looking for the people who had conducted the 2017 assessment. The unsigned memo had no names, but it referenced a site visit in September 2017 by regional staff. DEC Region 5 covers a large territory, but the number of people who would be sent to assess a fire tower in the backcountry is small. It would likely be a forest ranger from the local patrol area, possibly accompanied by a forester or an engineer if structural assessment was the stated purpose. I spent an evening with the DEC's online staff directory, cross-referencing current Region 5 personnel with their listed duty stations and responsibilities. Then I did something that felt uncomfortable but necessary. I started making phone calls to people I knew in the Adirondack hiking and volunteer community, asking who the local ranger had been in 2017 for the area that included Oxbow Knob. The answer came from a trail maintainer named Roy Beach, who had worked with DEC rangers on brushing projects in the Hamilton County Wild Forest Tracts. The ranger assigned to that territory in 2017 was a man named Pete Calloway. Roy described him as competent, quiet, well-liked by the volunteer community. He had transferred to a different region in early 2019. The southern tier, Roy thought. Or maybe the Catskills. Roy didn't know why. I found a Pete Calloway listed as a DEC forest ranger in Region 3, which covers the lower Hudson Valley. The DEC directory included his duty station but not a direct phone number. I left a message with the Region 3 dispatch, identifying myself as a volunteer steward and asking Ranger Calloway to contact me about a historical fire tower question. He called me back on a Thursday evening in early August. His voice was careful, measured the voice of a man who was deciding in real time how much to say. I told him I was researching the history of the Oxbow Knob Tower as part of the Friends of Kempshall's documentation project. I didn't mention the FOIL request or Sandra's research. I asked if he'd been involved in any assessments of the tower during his time in Region 5. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I conducted a site visit to that tower in September of 2017. Standard assessment. I submitted my report to the regional office." I asked what he'd found. Another pause. I reported what I observed, and I recommended the structure be secured. That recommendation was accepted. I asked if the closure was due to structural issues. That's the language that was used, yes. I noticed the phrasing, the language that was used, not, "That was the reason." I asked him directly, "Was there something inside the cab?" The pause this time was long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then Pete Calloway said, "I'm going to give you some advice, and I want you to take it as it's intended. I'm not trying to scare you, and I'm not being dramatic. But I stood on that platform in September of 2017, and I opened that hatch, and what I saw in the cab was something I included in my report in as much detail as I could manage. That report apparently didn't make it into the FOIL response you received. And I can't control that. What I can tell you is that my recommendation to secure the tower was not based on structural concerns. It was based on the fact that the interior of the cab had been substantially colonized by a biological growth that I could not identify and that did not resemble anything I'd encountered in 17 years of backcountry work." He was speaking carefully, like a man reading from a statement he'd prepared in his head. The growth covered approximately 60% of the interior surface's floor, walls, the underside of the roof, and the map table. It appeared to have entered through the floor, through the hatch seam, and through gaps around the support bolts. The material was dark, moist, and had a complex surface texture. It was warm to the touch. The ambient temperature inside the cab was noticeably higher than the outside air. I photographed everything and recommended immediate closure and specialist evaluation. Did specialist evaluation happen? Not while I was in the region. I followed up twice. I was told it was being handled at the state level. Then I was offered a transfer to Region 3, which I accepted. I asked if he thought the transfer was related. I think I was a good ranger who was offered a position closer to my family. I also think the timing was convenient for certain people at the regional level who were tired of me asking about a report that nobody wanted to discuss. He wished me luck and said he couldn't tell me anything more. Before he hung up, he added one thing. The growth was not static. Between my first visit in September and a follow-up I did on my own in November, it had expanded, noticeably, 2 months. 2 months, measurable expansion. In a closed cab, at elevation, through an Adirondack autumn when temperatures were dropping toward freezing. Whatever this organism was, cold wasn't stopping it. I relayed the conversation to Sandra and Diane. Sandra's reaction was the most measured and the most alarming. She said that certain fungal species in the phylum Basidiomycota are capable of generating metabolic heat through active decomposition, essentially keeping themselves warm by digesting their substrate. If the organism in the cab was feeding on the wood components of the structure, the original wooden map table, the window frames, any residual organic material, it could theoretically maintain a microclimate warmer and more humid than the surrounding air. But 60% coverage in a 7x7 cab is extraordinary, she said. That implies a biomass that shouldn't be possible at that elevation, on that substrate, in that climate, unless it has a nutrient source we're not seeing. I thought about the soil patch, the anomalous phosphorus, the rhizomorphs climbing the tower legs. Could it be transporting nutrients from the soil into the cab? I asked. Through the rhizomorphs. Sandra went quiet for several seconds. That's exactly what some cord-forming fungi do. They connect a nutrient source to a colonization front over distances that can be surprisingly long. It's well documented in forest floor ecology. But the scale you're describing from the ground, up 60 feet of steel tower, into a cab, that would be unprecedented, at least in anything I've read. She said the DNA results from her colleagues would take at least another few weeks. In the meantime, she wanted to go back to the tower and examine the other 3 footings more closely, and to run ground-penetrating radar if she could borrow the equipment, to see how extensive the subsurface mycelial network might be. We returned on August 14th. This time there were 4 of us: Sandra, Diane, myself, and a graduate student from ESF named Marcus, whom Sandra had recruited to help with equipment. We brought a portable GPR unit that Marcus had signed out from the college's geology department, along with more sampling supplies and a thermal imaging camera Sandra had borrowed from a colleague in the environmental science department. The morning was warm and still. 80 degrees at the trailhead, probably 75 at the summit. Summer peak. The bare soil patch looked the same, but the northeast footing didn't. The dark line that Sandra and I had observed in July had extended. In 6 weeks, the visible rhizomorphic growth along the metal concrete seam had advanced approximately 8 inches upward along the tower leg. Sandra measured and photographed it without speaking. Then she checked the other 3 footings. The southeast footing now showed the same dark growth. It hadn't been there in July. A new colonization front, freshly established, beginning the same path upward. Marcus ran the GPR in a grid pattern around the tower base, covering a 30-foot radius. I won't pretend to understand ground-penetrating radar in detail, but Sandra explained the results to me that evening in terms I could follow. The subsurface images showed a dense, irregular network of organic material radiating from a central mass directly beneath the tower. The network extended at least 20 feet in every direction, with the densest concentrations running along what appeared to be the root channels of long-dead trees that had been cleared when the tower was originally built in 1931. It's using the old root network as infrastructure, Sandra said. The dead roots give it a pre-built highway through the soil. That's actually not uncommon in fungal ecology. It's called preferential pathway colonization. What's uncommon is the scale and the apparent growth rate. The thermal camera was the last piece. I climbed the tower with it while Sandra, Diane, and Marcus waited below. Standing on the platform beneath the hatch, I pointed the camera upward at the cab floor. The image was clear and unambiguous. The cab floor, viewed through the thermal camera, was not a uniform temperature. There was a distinct heat signature, warmer than the surrounding steel and wood by approximately 6 degrees Celsius, concentrated in the center of the cab and extending toward the edges in an irregular pattern. It was consistent with a biological mass covering a significant portion of the interior floor and walls, generating its own metabolic heat. I was standing 3 feet below a locked door that contained a living organism of unknown species, unknown age, and unknown extent, which had been quietly growing inside a state-owned structure for at least 7 years, while the agency responsible for it had chosen to look away. I took the thermal images. I climbed down. I showed them to Sandra. She studied them for a long time, then looked up at the cab with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not excitement, not fear, but something that reminded me of the face a student makes when they realize a problem they've been solving has an answer they didn't anticipate. "This is going to need more than a Paul Smith's letterhead to open up," she said. In September, two things happened that moved the situation beyond anything I could control. First, Sandra's DNA results came back. The samples from the soil and the footing rhizomorph had been sequenced at both labs, and the results matched each other but matched nothing in the existing fungal databases. Not a close relative, not a distant cousin. The organism's rDNA sequences placed it tentatively within the Agaricales, a large order that includes common mushrooms, but the specific sequences diverged from known taxa at a level that Sandra's colleagues described in their email as genuinely confounding. One of them, the Michigan researcher, wrote, "This is either a novel species, a novel genus, or there's a contamination issue I can't identify. I'd like to see the site." The Michigan researcher came in late September. So did a mycologist from the New York Botanical Garden, whom Sandra had contacted independently, and a soil ecologist from Cornell who'd heard about the anomalous phosphorus data through the ESF network. Within weeks, the Oxbow Tower had gone from a locked curiosity to an active site of interest for 4 institutions. DEC's position became harder to maintain. When Sandra submitted a second access request, co-signed by researchers at 3 universities and a botanical garden, with attached preliminary data, the agency could no longer plausibly treat it as a casual inquiry. The assistant director who had denied the first request didn't respond to the second one. Instead, Diane received a phone call from Cliff Sutherland at Region 5, who sounded, she told me later, like a man who had just been told to cooperate. Access was granted for October 7th under DEC supervision. A forest ranger would accompany us, open the cab, and remain present throughout the assessment. We were given 4 hours. I was not part of the official research team. I'm a physics teacher, not a mycologist, but Sandra included me as a field assistant, and DEC didn't object. Diane came as the Friends Group representative. The ranger assigned to escort us was a young woman named Kate Fiorelli, who was professional, courteous, and visibly uncomfortable. She met us at the trailhead at 7 in the morning and hiked with us to the summit without saying much. At the base of the tower, she paused and said, "I want you all to know that I haven't been inside the cab. I was briefed, but I haven't seen it personally. I'm going to open the hatch, and then I'll stay on the platform unless you need me." We climbed in order: Kate first, then Sandra, then the Michigan mycologist, then me. Kate worked the padlock with a key, not the combination. Someone had given her a specific key for this lock. She pushed the hatch open and stepped aside on the landing. Sandra went through first. I heard her inhale sharply, but she said nothing. The Michigan mycologist followed. Then I pulled myself through the hatch into the cab of Tower 7. I've thought about how to describe what I saw in a way that's accurate, without being either sensational or diminishing. I'm going to try to do what I've done throughout this account: describe what was there. The interior of the cab was warm. Noticeably, immediately warm, at least 15 degrees warmer than the outside air, which was in the mid-40s. The air was humid, heavy with the smell I'd been detecting faintly through the hatch for months. In the enclosed space, it was overwhelming. Organic, sweet, fungal, with an undertone I can only describe as mineral. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled like growth. The walls of the cab were covered. Not entirely, there were patches of original wood surface still visible, particularly near the windows, but across perhaps 70% of the wall's surfaces. A dark, textured biological growth had established itself. It was the same color as the rhizomorphs at the footings, nearly black, with a slight iridescence when the light from the windows hit it at certain angles. The texture was complex, smooth in some areas, raised and almost sculptural in others, with patterns that reminded me of the surface of bracket fungi, but on a finer scale. The floor was entirely covered. The original wooden floorboards were invisible beneath a continuous mat of the same material, thicker here, with visible moisture beading on its surface. Where the hatch opened, the growth had been interrupted. It had grown to the edge of the hatch frame and stopped, as though respecting the boundary of the opening. The cut edge was clean and showed a layered internal structure, a dense outer rind surrounding a spongy interior matrix that was pale and slightly luminescent in the dim cab light. The map table was still there, in the center of the cab, but it was incorporated. The growth had covered it completely, following the contours of the circular table and the Osborne fire finder still mounted on it. You could see the shape of the instrument beneath the growth, like a sculpture draped in dark cloth. The fire finder's sighting arm protruded through the covering layer, and around the point of protrusion, the growth had formed a tight seal. Sandra and the Michigan mycologist moved through the cab slowly, photographing, sampling, measuring. They spoke to each other in low tones, using terminology I mostly didn't follow. I stood near the hatch and watched. What struck me wasn't the strangeness of it. It was the coherence. This didn't look like uncontrolled growth, like mold spreading randomly across a surface. It looked organized. The thickness varied in patterns that seemed purposeful. The areas near the windows were thinner, almost translucent, as though the organism were allowing light through. The areas away from the windows were thicker, denser, as though insulating. The floor mat was the thickest of all. And Sandra confirmed later that it was the primary source of the metabolic heat the organism was most active where it had the most substrate to consume. The Michigan mycologist said one word to Sandra that I did hear clearly. He said, "Unprecedented." She nodded. We spent 3 hours and 40 minutes inside the cab. The research team collected over 30 samples, took hundreds of photographs, made temperature and humidity readings at dozens of points, and documented the growth patterns on every surface. Kate Fiorelli came up at the end, looked inside, and said nothing. Her face didn't change expression, but she locked the hatch afterward with what I thought was more care than strictly necessary. On the hike down, nobody spoke much. The Michigan mycologist walked with Sandra, and they had a quiet conversation I couldn't hear. Diane walked beside me and said, "Well, now we know why they locked it." We did, and the answer wasn't conspiracy, wasn't malice, wasn't some sinister cover-up. It was an agency that had found something genuinely outside its experience, in a location that wasn't a priority, during a period of chronic underfunding and understaffing, and had done the only thing it could think to do, close the door, and hope someone eventually came along who could explain it. No one had, for 7 years, because no one had been asked. The agency's failure wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was the institutional equivalent of putting something in a closet because you don't know what shelf it belongs on. Sandra's full analysis is still ongoing as I tell this. The DNA sequencing has confirmed that the organism is a previously undescribed species. The Michigan and Cornell teams are collaborating on a formal taxonomic description. The growth rate, nutrient transport mechanism, and metabolic heat generation are all subjects of active research. DEC has agreed to maintain the closure while granting supervised research access on a recurring schedule. The Friends of Kempshall have been formally briefed and have, at Diane's recommendation, agreed not to seek public restoration of the Oxbow Tower until the research reaches a natural conclusion. I am not a biologist. I am a physics teacher who volunteers on weekends because he likes fire towers. I got into this because I asked a simple question: why is this one tower locked? And the answer turned out to involve mycology, institutional inertia, FOIL requests, thermal cameras, ground-penetrating radar, and a living organism that has been quietly transforming a 7 by 7 foot steel and wood box on an Adirondack ridge into something that nobody expected. I can tell you everything that was found. I can show you the photographs, the thermal images, the DNA results, the soil chemistry. Sandra can explain the biology better than I ever could. What none of us can explain, what Sandra says may take years to understand, if it's understood at all, is why this particular organism, in this particular location, chose to grow upward. 60 feet of steel tower with no organic substrate, no obvious nutrient pathway, just galvanized metal and bolted connections, and it climbed. It found the cab, it found the wood, and it made itself a home that was warmer and wetter than anything at 2,800 feet in the Adirondacks has any right to be. Fungi don't choose, I know that. They follow chemical gradients, moisture differentials, gravity, light. Sandra has explained the mechanisms to me multiple times. But she also told me, during one of our phone calls in late October, that none of those mechanisms adequately account for the directionality of the growth. The rhizomorphs didn't explore randomly and happen to find the tower. The GPR data shows them growing toward it from a distance, oriented, directed. There's a signal, she said. Something in or about that structure attracted the organism from the beginning. I don't know what it is. It might be something as simple as a mineral leaching from the concrete footings, or a galvanic current in the steel. It might be something we haven't considered. But the growth isn't random. It knew where it was going. I think about that word, knew, and I understand she was using it loosely, the way a scientist does when casual language is the only tool that fits. Fungi don't know. They respond. But standing on that platform, smelling that warm, living air rising through the hatch, looking at an organism that had climbed 60 feet of dead steel to find the one small room where it could grow, find that the distinction between knowing and responding feels less clear than it used to. That's not the unanswered question, though. The unanswered question is simpler and, to me, more unsettling. Pete Calloway told me the growth covered 60% of the cab in September 2017, when we entered on October 7th, 2024. 7 years later, it covered 70%. Sandra confirmed these estimates independently based on her surface area measurements. 7 years. 10% expansion. That's a dramatic slowdown from what Calloway described in those first 2 months, and from the growth rate Sandra projected based on the rhizomorph advancement at the footings. The organism, by all evidence, should have filled the cab completely years ago. It didn't. It reached a threshold, and it slowed, almost stopped. Sandra doesn't have an explanation for that. The nutrient supply through the rhizomorphs appears continuous. The metabolic activity is stable. The organism isn't dying, it's maintaining. Holding at 70%, as though 70% were the point, and further expansion were unnecessary. I asked Sandra what she thought it meant. She said, "It means the organism reached a homeostatic equilibrium with the cab environment. It grew until its metabolic output matched the energy and moisture losses through the cab walls and windows, and then it stabilized." I asked if that was normal. She was quiet for a while. It's rational, she said. Whether it's normal, I honestly don't know. I've never seen a fungal organism regulate its own growth to match an enclosed environment this precisely. It's behaving less like a colonizer and more like a tenant. A tenant. In a 7x7 room on top of a 60-foot tower on an Adirondack ridge. Paying no rent, generating its own heat, maintaining its own humidity. Fed by a root network it built through 90-year-old soil. Settled in. I still volunteer on Kempshall most summer weekends. On clear days, I can see Oxbow Knob from the cab, and sometimes I look at it through the binoculars. The tower looks the same as it always has. Steel and glass and sky. You'd never know. But I know. And now, so do you.